Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our weekly Learn in Your Lunchtime webinar. And I'm just thrilled to have Natasha Frank back with us. This is her second time on the show. So good afternoon, Natasha. How are you feeling today?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me, Peter. And really happy it's Friday and excited about the opportunity to shed some light on this topic of emotional intelligence.
No, absolutely. And I think it's also backed by a popular demand. Between yourself and Tracy, you guys are sort of definitely in demand and are sort of most valued, most viewed, most watched guests on the Student Success Coach YouTube channel. So guys, before we get into our topic for today, which is obviously emotional intelligence and getting a job, and we're also going to unpack a little bit about what emotional intelligence is and just draw on some of the insights and experience and training that Natasha has been through, because it is such an enormously important topic for all of us. First thing I do want to say is, if we've got any University of Pretoria students on the call today, I'm sure you guys are feeling absolutely proud to have Tatiana Schoonmaker as one of your student colleagues, having won the gold early this morning in the 200-meter breaststroke. So any Tuckies University students, please do let us know in the chat. But as always, anybody, just please say hi, give us some love, tell us what you want to know about emotional intelligence, and then obviously also, where you are coming from today, wherever you are in the country, whichever university you're part of, and how things are going with you today. And just as we have been doing for the last couple of weeks, just acknowledging also everything else that's been going on in the country and the challenges that people have. And I think, Tasha, emotional intelligence is going to be an important part of our reaction to, difficult issues around us, such as what we've been experiencing, whether it's pandemic or whether it's unrest or whether it's just the emotional strain of, looking for a job or getting through a degree, things that all of us face in the modern era. And I think what Natasha, you, me, Tracy, many others, in this platform and in this community and in the student community more broadly in South Africa are very focused on trying to help students get through and deal with. So we're looking forward to getting into some of those discussions today. Boitumelo, yes, what a great way to start my day. Also saw that when I woke up this morning. I didn't set the alarm to get up, but great to have seen the news early this morning. And Jack also says they're so proud. So, I think it is a fantastic day. First gold medal from Tuckies University. And as we did last week, and as we always do every Friday, we have a lot of people from Tuckies join us. So I was just hoping that you guys could give us a little bit of a shout out and give us a sense of, the vibe inside Pretoria University. I'm sure you've all been well aware and following the news. And what I would really like, if I could just ask right up front, if anybody, knows Tatiana and whether, we could get her on this webinar in the future at any time, I'd be very grateful if you could reach out to me and connect me with her. But I'm sure she's going to have, obviously, a huge demand, to talk to people and to get in front of interviews and talk about her experiences. Then we've got Ndumiso, UP student here as well. Okay, fantastic. And we should have a number of University of Limpopo students. So Natasha, I did a session this morning at 9 o'clock with the University of Limpopo students, one of their faculties, and we spoke about this webinar. And really the topic was CV writing. And during this webinar, I'll just put the CV masterclass that myself and Tracy recently launched. I'll put that into the chat. And you guys can take advantage of that. But we mentioned the University of Limpopo were, quite keen to join the webinar today and draw on Natasha's experience. So any University of Limpopo, and great timing there. Good morning to everyone, University of Limpopo. So I think you might have been in the session this morning. So that's absolutely fantastic. Okay, so Natasha, right, let's get into this topic of emotional intelligence. So, over to you, just an open-ended question. And maybe just before you answer that question, just a little introduction to yourself, a little bit of background, if anybody missed last week's show, and then dive into however your sort of initial framing or thinking is around, emotional intelligence and student life and workplace readiness, etc. Natasha, welcome again.
Thank you so much, Peter. So I guess just a quick introduction from me. I am a career development practitioner. I'm a psychometrist by profession, and prior to sort of, going on my own in the last 3 or 4 years, I worked in corporate in the financial sector for close on a decade, and for the better part of that decade worked in graduate development. So that sort of really started my my work in this space, engaging with young talent, helping students transition from university into the world of work. And this really is kind of like my passion and heart work. I love being able to help young people learn the relevant skills and acquire the tools that are necessary to be successful in the world of work. And I mean, I think South Africa is just so diverse. And also when you've been in the world of work and corporate for a long time, I think sometimes you just forget what it feels like to be a young person and how overwhelming it can really be to move from university into the world of work. A lot of things that we take for granted that we know and are kind of able to navigate unconsciously is quite an effort for young people. So it's really just about, the likes of you, myself, Tracy, and so many others, just sharing some of our knowledge to help young people put their best foot forward.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Natasha. Fantastic. So, I mean, if we get into the topic for today of emotional intelligence, let's just kick off with maybe just a bit of an overview of what is emotional intelligence. And then, using that definition, we can take some questions from everybody. So please, guys, do pop some questions into the chat, and I see there are some questions coming through. But Natasha, just give us that, definition of emotional intelligence, and then let's use that to get into a good in-depth conversation today about the topic. And I also just want to mention Kathy Sims from South African Graduate Employers Association. Hello, Kathy. Great to have you with us today. We've had Kathy on the show previously, and I'll actually put a link to that webinar in the chat because it was just so useful, touching on what Natasha was talking about, in terms of helping students find employment, understand what the demand is for different skills and different qualifications, etc. And Sagia and their website, absolutely fantastic, useful resource for students to explore that world of working. But Natasha, emotional intelligence, break it down for us, please.
Okay, so nice to have you with us, Kathy. And so emotional intelligence. And Peter, I feel like I just need to backtrack a little bit before I kind of get into emotional intelligence. And I often quite like to link it to this concept of success, right? So, like, what is success? And simply put, it's the ability to set and achieve your personal and professional goals, whatever they may be. So an individual's definition of success will quite naturally ebb and flow over time. We want different things and pursue different goals as we age. And this is also dependent on the particular role in our life that we're attempting to fulfill. So whether that is student, parent, spouse, etc., our definition of success often centers on what is our main focus at any given time. And the reason I talk about this concept of success is because historically, cognitive intelligence was seen as the cornerstone of success. So if you were intellectually gifted, you could possibly receive a good education, get a good job, and financial reward and security was long considered the primary result of that intelligence. However, in recent years, we've begun to appreciate the powerful links between emotional intelligence and a greater, better rounded definition of success, which embraces aspects like work, vocation, personal relationships, spiritual and emotional well-being. So the 21st century has seen what I like to call an EQ explosion. And I say this because in 1995, Daniel Goleman, we sort of term him the father of emotional intelligence, he popularized this field of study through the appearance of his book titled Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. And I do want to say upfront that emotional intelligence is not the opposite of intelligence. It's not the triumph of heart over head. It's the unique intersection of both. And my sister actually shared that quote this morning on LinkedIn, and I thought it's quite apt, because there's this debate around, well, what makes me more successful? Is it my cognitive intelligence? Is it my emotional intelligence? And for students, it's actually both. We really need both to be able to succeed in the world of work. So coming back to, Daniel Goleman and his book, there was a seismic response to his work, because like at long last, the so-called soft skills, which play such a significant role in our success in the workplace and our relationships, was something that was actually being considered seriously by mainstream educators and business people. So that's just a little bit of background around this, this kind of dynamic between intelligence, cognitive intelligence, and emotional intelligence. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, it's often what we refer to as street smarts, or that uncommon ability that we label common sense. And when we talk about emotional intelligence, it's about our ability to perceive our own emotions, to manage those emotions, and then to be able to recognize the emotions and behaviors in others. So I actually want to read this definition. It's actually from a book that I quite enjoy called EQ Edge. And I think it really touches on the different aspects of emotional intelligence. So this quote out of a book from out of the book called EQ Edge, it says, "It has to do with our capacity to objectively assess our strengths, as well as be open to viewing and challenging our limitations, mistaken assumptions, unacknowledged biases, and short-sighted or self-defeating beliefs. Emotional intelligence also encompasses our ability to read the political and social environment and landscape them, to intuitively grasp what others want and need, what their strengths and weaknesses are, to remain unruffled by stress, and to be engaging and the kind of person others want to be around." So, I mean, that's quite a mouthful, but I think it really just speaks to the breadth of what emotional intelligence, or EQ, is. So, I mean, if I maybe just put out the question, and maybe to everyone listening, is just take a moment. Think about a teacher, a lecturer, or a manager that you admire. And often the reason we admire these people is because they tend to be the engaging type of people we want to be around. Conversely, if you have to imagine a teacher, a lecturer, or a manager that you maybe you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time around, we often can relate some of these aspects to emotional intelligence. And like I said, it's quite broad, but it's our experiences of people. You can have a lecturer who is just the smartest person. I mean, they're so knowledgeable, but they don't necessarily know how to share that information, or they can be quite abrasive to be around, versus somebody who does have the knowledge and is able to communicate that in a way that makes people feel comfortable. These are drawing on an emotionally intelligent skill set.
Brilliant, Natasha. Thank you. And I think that's just a good call to action for everybody to, activate that awareness of others, and think about people that they interact with, and start to put into practice, what they're learning today about emotional intelligence. And I guess then now equally there's that self-awareness, as you were talking about just now, where, Natasha, and I guess a question from my side, do we then see emotions as a natural human response to things? And emotional intelligence is about our awareness and how we manage those emotions. It's not that we need to be less emotional, because, I mean, emotions generally, I would imagine, can be healthy. I mean, there are very positive emotions. Yes, some negative ones that we maybe need to be aware of, etc. But that emotional intelligence, and the idea that it's a part of who we are, rather than an all-consuming, dominating force, in our life. Just tell me about the relationship then between the natural emotional response that we have to life. And I think if we all look at what's happened in the country over the last couple of weeks, and even over the last 18 months with the pandemic, globally speaking, naturally we have emotional responses to those as individuals, as families, etc. But it's about then, as you say, managing those and being aware of them, and understanding the dynamic play between the head and the heart, the cognitive response and the emotional response to them. So maybe just talk a little bit about, the fact that emotions are still there, and they're a natural part of who we are as human beings. But now let's gear it maybe into the self-awareness of how we then manage those and make it practical for us. And I've got a question from Donovan here, who says that he's currently doing masters in mechanical engineering while juggling a full-time job as a junior engineer. How do I stay motivated to pursue my master's? So just to paraphrase Donovan, I'm sure that some of his emotions is, stress and demotivation, coming from loss of sleep and being overworked, etc. How does he take this idea of emotional intelligence and apply that to achieve the balance or the motivation that he's asking for here in this question?
So, Peter, I think also just to touch on what you have mentioned around self-awareness, for me, I think the cornerstone of emotional intelligence really is self-awareness, because it unlocks a lot of the other emotionally intelligent behaviors. So I think, in terms of EQ, there's sort of five aspects, five kind of key aspects to it. And the first one is definitely, how do I see myself? How aware of my emotions am I? In order to be aware of my emotions and to be in touch with who I am then able to express myself to others in this world. So there's definitely a link between self-awareness and the expression of those emotions. So those are sort of the two aspects that I'm speaking about. The other three then relate to, how do I interact and engage with others? How do I use emotional information to make decisions? And then how do I manage sort of the natural stress in my life? And I think that is what that particular question relates to. And it comes back to that awareness of, okay, so I'm juggling these different things. What emotions are those stirring? What emotions are those stirring within me? If I'm able to name what I'm feeling and experiencing, then I'm able to actually address that. And I think so often, and coming back to, we are emotional beings. So it's definitely not suppressing those emotions, but it's also not allowing our emotions to run wild. So I think if there's an awareness of, either I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling stretched, whatever the case might be, if we're able to name those emotions, we can then start to address them, put mechanisms in place to be able to cope with those emotions that we're experiencing. So, like you said, Peter, and I think coming back to students and perhaps even touching on why emotional intelligence is important, the workplace is quite an interesting environment because it's a group of different people who come together to achieve a common goal. And in order to achieve those goals and achieve success, people need to get along and support each other. But like you said, we know that human beings are emotional creatures. So it's natural to feel happy, sad, angry, excited, whatever else from day to day. And the key is to understand those emotions and express them in a healthy way that is well received by others. So I think as we've been chatting around what is emotional intelligence, I do want to perhaps touch on what it isn't, because there are also, I think, a lot of misnomers around what EQ is all about. And, when we were talking about cognitive intelligence versus emotional intelligence, the good news about EQ is that it is a skill that can be developed, and it's very much influenced by what is happening in our lives and the world around us. I think, like we've seen quite significantly in the media of recent. So there will be seasons in your life where certain strands or aspects of emotional intelligence are stronger, whereas at other times, those same components may require some attention. So the good news is that EQ is not static. It's definitely something that fluctuates. It can be developed. It can be grown if it's an area that you choose to deliberately focus on. The other thing I want to mention is that EQ is not a woman thing. Sometimes, we talk about women being emotional. It's definitely not a woman thing. Women are not necessarily better at emotionally intelligent behaviors. Neither are men worse off at emotionally intelligent behaviors. I think touching on what you've said, emotional intelligence is not about being emotional either. So it is definitely about that awareness of what I'm feeling and taking a moment to consider the appropriate response to that emotion. So just because we're feeling an emotion, it doesn't give us the permission to act on it in whatever way we think is suitable. And when we talk about, the management of those emotions, it is definitely around thinking about, in this moment, do I say something? Do I express it? Do I think on it a little further? If you are experiencing hurt over something, it might be easier to express that hurt in a situation where it's maybe your best friend versus your boss who said something, or your lecturer. So it is definitely around assessing the appropriacy of expressing that emotion. It's also, I think sometimes people go, and when we were talking about, think about that manager or that lecturer that you admire. Emotional intelligence is not about being nice, because sometimes we get it confused with emotional intelligence is about being around people who are good or people who are nice. And it's definitely not about that, because sometimes being nice might mean that I experience these emotions. Maybe I have felt that somebody hurt me, but because I want to be nice, I just avoid or suppress those emotions. And that's not something that's really healthy either. And when we talk about developing an emotionally intelligent skill set to put us in better stead in our relationships at work or our relationships with family or friends, it's not about tapping into a space where I'm using the skill set to manipulate others to achieve a personal task or goal. There's definitely, sometimes we go, well, how can I be a little bit more like this? Or how can I be a bit more persuasive? Or how can I, convince the other person to do what I want? It's definitely not about being manipulative. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on.
Natasha,
this is not
100%. No, thank you. I mean, this is just such a masterclass of emotional intelligence this afternoon. So I hope everybody realizes just how useful and important this information is that we're getting from Natasha. I wanted to just come back to, we answered Donovan and then, you sort of talked about the mechanisms of expressing emotion. That was the one phrase that you used, which I thought was great. And then the second one was linked to maybe sort of the daily practices of creating that improved self-awareness. So I just wanted you to touch on those two aspects, if possible. So the one was just, what I thought quite nicely was emotional intelligence is not about suppressing emotions or being more or less emotional. It's just having that awareness of them and understanding them and being and thinking through them. So that was great. But the mechanism of expressing emotion in the right way to increase emotional intelligence, and then the practices daily or otherwise that you would advise somebody and that you could perhaps recommend to Donovan and other people on the call today that help also, increase emotional intelligence.
So I think we touched on some of these things actually when we spoke about psychometrics. And this is why I also say that self-awareness, which, we're trying to, I think, unpack in a bit more detail, is so important, because it definitely does unlock this toolbox called, emotional intelligence, where there are so many different tools in there. And it's about using the right tool in the right situation at the right time. So when we talk about self-awareness, it's definitely an awareness of what you are feeling. And, we tend to have this really limited vocabulary when it comes to emotions, where I think in the English language, there's hundreds of words that can describe emotions, but we have quite a limited emotional vocabulary. Sometimes we go, it's like a good emotion or a bad emotion, or it's happy, sad, angry, but there's just such a range. And there's a distinction between feeling angry, annoyed, irritated, resentful. There's a whole range that would fall within that particular spectrum of emotions. So for me, I think, when we talk about self-awareness, it's really around catching yourself in that moment. If you're feeling something, maybe you go like, I'm feeling a little uneasy today. I think it's just taking time out. And this is why when we spoke about psychometrics the last time, it's definitely around slowing down the pace in our lives. Because often when we're just rushing from one thing to the next, and we're living in a world of instant gratification, it is actually quite difficult to train our brains to slow down the pace. And I mean, I even do it. For example, when we're going through emails or you're reading stuff, you've gotten so used to maybe skimming through things, wanting to get through things a lot quicker, that we actually have to train ourselves to slow down the pace. And that definitely, I think, helps us to become more aware. So, even if it's reflecting around, well, what actually happened in my day yesterday, or taking time out, I like to start off my day with being able to do that, just to wake up early, to have some time that's quiet, to be able to reflect on what my day holds for me. And I know I was saying with students, I don't know how many students actually journal, whether you actually take a book and a pen or it's an online journal. But I think just being able to capture some of those things is so important to bringing back the self-awareness. I mean, the other aspect, and I don't want to get into the technicalities around sort of the structure of our brain, but often we can, our emotions can actually hijack some of what is some of our logical responses. And when I, like I said, I don't want to get into the neuropsychology of it all, but the pace or the rate at which our emotional brain works is a lot faster than our logical brain. And I think slowing down the pace, creating space for self-awareness is so important. Sometimes when somebody's just feeling so frustrated and a friend will say, well, just take a moment and breathe. It sounds like, how is that going to even help me? But actually, when we breathe, we allow the oxygen that we're breathing in to actually filter and go to our brain. When we can get oxygen back into our brain, we can then engage the logical part of our brain. And rather than having an emotional hijack, we can try and handle the situation better. So from an emotional self-awareness perspective, slowing down the pace, taking the time to think through things, counting to 10, breathing, extricating yourself from that situation is all helpful to allow you to get time to just think on how you're going to respond.
Yeah, Natasha, wonderful. And Louise just asked if there's a possibility to get in touch with you for an appointment. And Natasha does offer these services professionally as part of her business. So I put your website in the chat there, Natasha. And I want to talk a little bit just now in a few minutes about some of the other things that you do and some of the wonderful initiatives that you've got coming up in the next few weeks, and particularly in August that you want to launch. But before we get there, maybe let's just take a couple of questions. I mean, Shannon says, for example, this is very important, especially with COVID and lockdowns and the unrest. And we've had mental health, experts on the show previously, and it is certainly something that is becoming very important. But I want to just dive in on Henko's question, Natasha, because I think this is really directly linked to, the bulk of the people that are watching today and these sort of expectations of how emotional intelligence supports a student journey and then transitioning from that student journey into the workplace. So, and if people are just listening today on the podcast, Henko asks, how can I manage my EQ to figure out what I want to do with my life and know my career choice? Because I kind of feel lost. So, Natasha, your thoughts on that would be great. But Henko, I just want to encourage you, and I've also put the Facebook group link on the chat because, that's also a safe space where people can come and get support. Yes, it's digital and it is social. And you will need to, make an appointment either with Natasha or speak to trusted people, friends, family, etc., for other aspects and different conversations, etc. But certainly this community is a safe space for you to raise this type of question and to be vulnerable. So I just want to commend you and thank you for doing that. And I recall in the mental health webinar that we had with Melissa Ardendorf earlier on in the year, I also shared my own journey with depression a number of years ago. And I think that vulnerability, in the safe space of a community like we have in the Student Success Coach is always often just a catalyst for other people to share and grow and to learn. So Natasha, your thoughts to Henko on this question?
So Henko, thank you so much for that question. And, I think in terms of figuring out this, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? I'm not really certain about the career path I've chosen, or I'm just feeling completely lost, like you've said. Taps into more than just EQ. But if we look at it from sort of an emotional intelligence kind of framework, and this is something that I like to adopt into my practice and the work that I do, and I'm probably, I've said this so many times, but really it does start with getting to know who you are. And when we look at EQ and one of the assessments that I use, it starts with self-perception, and some of the strands under that scale is, how do I see myself? How do I see myself? What are some of the goals that I want to set in my life? And how aware am I of the emotions that I'm feeling? And coming back to Henko's question, it definitely starts with getting in touch with yourself. And why I say it extends to more than just EQs, because then we tap into cognitive intelligence. So what is your aptitude? What is your abilities? We've got to tap into what are your interests? What are some of the environments that you enjoy being in? What are your values? What are the things that are important in your life? And some of those aspects will definitely weave in and out of emotional intelligence, but we look at those strands individually and then bring it back, because, like you said, Peter, human beings are complex. There's so many different facets, and I try to avoid the debate between cognitive intelligence and emotional intelligence, because both are really important. We have to learn to bring both of them together to enable success in our lives. So yeah, it definitely comes back to knowing who I am. And once we have a solid understanding of that, we then work on how do we want to put that out into the market. And, it still surprises me. And so often with young people, and I'll touch on this now, some of those interview questions that tap into assessing emotional intelligence. The cliched question, tell me about yourself. A lot of people are just floored by that question, because I think we're just not, well, on the one hand, we're not very aware of who we are. And then I think on the other hand, it's a little awkward around talking about ourselves. But self-regard and self-confidence are also important aspects of emotional intelligence.
Okay. Thank you, Natasha. Appreciate that. And then there's a question here that says, what advice would you give a neurodivergent person such as myself with BPD? So just a great sort of vulnerable, authentic question here again. In terms of coping with stress and interpersonal relationships in the workplace.
And is it bad?
Yeah.
So, I think also when we're talking about this concept of emotional intelligence and assessments, etc., we definitely don't look at it from a diagnostic perspective. So what advice would I give someone like that in the workplace? I guess it's a bit of a difficult one, because I'm not sure the extent to which others or colleagues, may be aware of some of the difficulties you might be facing. And again, it is something that's vulnerable, and there's often, a lot of stigma attached to some of these things. So I think at the end of the day, it's really around what are we putting in place to manage the challenges that we have in our lives. And it definitely comes back again to this relationship around self-awareness and self-management. So what are the things that I need to put in place to be able to manage some of those challenges, whether, and again, sometimes when we talk about like emotions being triggered, for example, I think within ourselves, we need to understand what are those emotional triggers and what we need to do to manage some of those triggers. So emotional intelligence is definitely not avoiding our emotions or suppressing our emotions. But I think in the same breath, if we have certain emotional triggers, and I'll maybe use sort of a bit of a frivolous example, like, if your neighbor or if your neighbor, for example, just seems to rub you up the wrong way, then avoid that trigger or limit that trigger. So it's definitely important to understand what are our emotional triggers and what is the right response in being able to manage it. And sometimes limiting those triggers is quite key to actually being able to manage those triggers.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. And what if those triggers are unavoidable? So, I mean, all of us, that have been through degrees and qualifications and challenges in the workplace, I mean, 100% agree with you. And if your mental health condition, exacerbates those triggers, then even more reason to manage them in your life. But, everyone will have assignments and exams and pressure, and some of those can have emotional triggers, but that's a reality of getting a degree, getting into the workplace. I mean, even going for an interview, for a job can be a significant emotional trigger for people, and something that they would need advice and help to kind of work through. So there's Linda Kushler's question here about how to use emotional intelligence to better respond to pressures at schools. Just at school, just your thoughts on getting through those sorts of issues from an emotional intelligence perspective.
So, I mean, I guess, some of the recent questions have really been around cultivating emotional intelligence. And, I guess there's something as simple as, often when we meet people, dozens of times in our week or engagements with friends or families or even strangers, right? We're met with this question, how are you? It's sort of become just, I guess, a courteous kind of question, how are you? And most of us know that this question doesn't really get an honest answer. We generally reply with good, fine, some of those terms. But I think if we're really honest with ourselves, most of us would actually be a bit uncomfortable if we got a more genuine answer. So, I mean, for many of us, it feels quite risky to get in touch with our feelings, let alone express them to others. And I think, one of those questions around dealing with the pressures at school. So psychologist Mark Brackett at Yale University came up with this acronym, which I'd really like to share in this context around being able to cultivate emotional intelligence. And the acronym was called RULER. Okay, so the R in this acronym, the first R, is being able to recognize our emotions. And I know this may sound easy, but it's equally easy to actually ignore our feelings. I mean, have you ever said, for example, that you don't care about something when you really do? So the first part of this acronym is being able to recognize that I am having an emotional response, whether it is feeling overwhelmed or feeling stressed. And, that feeling of stress is really around, I feel that the demands in my capacity, my innate capacity or capability is not able to meet the demands in my environment, versus when I feel overwhelmed, and that's just about, there's just too much of stuff going on in my environment. So it's around making that distinction. So we recognize our emotions. The U moves on to being able to then understand those emotions. So first I recognize I'm actually having an emotional response. In short, when we talk about understanding those emotions, it's why am I feeling this way? So I recognize I'm having an emotional response. Let me ask myself, why am I feeling this way? Am I feeling this way because I have an interview in 2 hours and the butterflies are kind of that normal response? Am I feeling this way because I have exams coming up last week, and because of whatever was going on in my life, I haven't been able to put in the study time that I would have hoped? So it's really being able to understand and have an answer for that question, why? And sometimes it's not as straightforward. Sometimes it actually takes a little bit more time to really think about, okay, why am I feeling this way? And it might at times be asking myself the question, what happened this morning? Or what happened yesterday? What is different in my environment? What might be different in my environment now compared to maybe last week, for example? So you may have to ask yourself some of those probing questions in terms of being able to understand the emotion. The L in the acronym is then being able to label that emotion, right? So finding the right word to describe it. And like I said, many of us seem to have a relatively limited emotional vocabulary, and it is distinguishing between, like, am I angry? Am I annoyed? Am I disappointed? Am I resentful? Like, what is that emotion? So the first 3 letters is all around being able to look within and to ask some of those intrapersonal questions. When we get to the E, it's about expressing the emotion. So what do I actually now do with this emotion? And do I express it? And there's lots of reasons, that we hesitate to express our feelings. And I think at times, sometimes we say it's around being able to limit those triggers. But like you were asking, Peter, maybe we're not able to limit those triggers. And then it's finding constructive ways to be able to express that emotion. And sometimes we have to tap into those stress management strategies. And for different people, it might be different things. And I think sometimes personality also plays a role into this. So, for extroverts, for example, I think sometimes just being able to release that stress is just social interaction. And now with COVID, like somebody mentioned, that's probably been a lot harder. So for others, it may be going to the gym. For somebody who enjoys cooking or playing a musical instrument or has a hobby, it is definitely around finding the space and time to be able to de-stress. For others, it may be meditation or prayer. So it is really around knowing what works for you in being able to express that. And at times, it might even be involve having that difficult conversation with that person where you need to express that emotion, whether it's disappointment. And I know this is a tricky one, right? Because, Peter, our families of origin play such a huge role in our expression of emotions. And often when I do workshops or I have one-on-one conversations with people, I like to ask the question, what role did emotions play in your family of origin? And it could be anything from, in my family, we were quite an expressive family. We would hug and we would cry and we would fight. And like the next moment we'd make up and everything would be fine. Whereas in another family, it's like, we never spoke about our emotions. There's no place for emotions in this family. Big boys don't cry kind of thing. So it's also, I think, just tapping into and recognizing what role did emotions play in our family of origin. And then being able to work out for yourself, well, is this something that's helping me or hindering me? So yes, that's the expression. And then I think we've touched on, the regulating of those emotions is how do we then cope with those feelings? And I think coming back to the notion of success, it's about being able to deal with those emotions in a way that will allow us to best meet our personal and professional goals, or at least to prevent our feelings from interfering with them.
Wonderful. Okay, so I've just put it up on the screen there. Recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate, or regulating. Okay. Brilliant. Ruler. Fantastic. Natasha, I've learned something today. So thank you very much for that just very powerful framework that we can take forward and apply in our own lives. So really appreciate that. Now, Natasha, thank you. This has been just such an incredible discussion about such an important topic. I'd like you to talk about yourself now and what you offer and this incredible initiative that you were telling me about the other day, and how that's going to help give back and what you'd like to potentially offer to people. And I have put your website onto the chat, and I did see that you've updated your website with further information, so you can send them there and they've got that link. But just tell us more about what you've got coming up in the next few weeks.
So, thank you, Peter, for sharing the link. And students, you're more than welcome to go ahead and visit it, just to get a little bit more information on more of my offering. But I think, Peter, what Peter's specifically referring to and what I chatted to him about the other day was what I like to call Mad Mondays, my Mad Mondays special. And MAD is also an acronym. It stands for Make a Difference Mondays. And this is really just where I offer students free consultations around their careers. So we would look at anything from some of the self-awareness. How do I develop and create space in my life to become more self-aware so that I have an understanding of who I am, what I bring to the table when I'm sitting in front of an interview panel, through to let's look at my CV, how can I prepare for an interview, etc. So yeah, that's the Mad Monday special. So students, I definitely encourage you to check it out. It's really just my way of actually starting off my week in a space where I can give of my time and energy to help young people meet their personal and professional goals.
So, Natasha, just if somebody wanted to take you up on that offer of a free consultation, I think you do limit it to 1 or 2 per student, but at least they can get that hour with you on a Monday. In August, I think you mentioned. Is there a page on your website specifically, and how do they ask for that free consultation on a Monday in the next few weeks? What's that process?
Yeah. So, I mean, they can definitely just go onto the booking page of my website and select consultation. And I think there's a space there just to add a note to say that you are a student.
Okay. And specifically, they want to be part of the Mad Monday initiative.
Yes.
That they'd like. Okay, fantastic. Okay, that's great, Natasha. Thank you so much. And then just briefly, I mean, your paid consultations, and I mean, I have heard incredible feedback from people who have had time with you, and there have been people that have, asked today on the chat for a paid consultation to achieve a specific outcome in their life, that they're willing to invest in a properly qualified professional person like yourself to assist them with. Maybe just break down, specifically what those other services are that then I presume you'll offer Tuesday to Friday in the rest of what you've given back to the community in such an incredible way on a Monday.
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely, I guess, aside from subject choice or study choice, which is perhaps sort of a younger target audience group, with the career consultations, I think in terms of my initial session, it is more of an intake session. So it's really just being able to understand the client, their background, what are their needs presently, and then we move forward in terms of, okay, now that I've got a bit of an understanding of where you're at, we can then decide to focus on, okay, maybe it's your CV that needs attention, maybe it's preparing for an interview, maybe it's looking at your LinkedIn profile, maybe it's a couple of these things. So I think off the cuff, it really is individual specific. But the initial session is to be able to meet the client at their point of need, and we take it from there.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned CVs, because I'd completely forgotten. I was just so engrossed in your thoughts on emotional intelligence. I'd completely forgotten to mention the CV masterclass, and you did mention it there, and I put the link into the chat there, which is the CV masterclass. And would you mind, Natasha, just to give a little bit of insight to Tracy, who's my co-instructor in that course? You know Tracy very well, as I do. And just to promote that course a little bit, which I've given everybody free access to today as well, but just maybe a couple of sentences on Tracy and her expertise as she demonstrates in that course for helping students to write a job-winning CV.
So, I mean, I've known Tracy probably about 13 or 14 years. She was actually my very first manager when I joined the world of corporate. So we really go way back. And I mean, I think at that time, being quite young and green, I definitely got the first-hand benefit of working alongside her and learning so much from her. So, I mean, she's got more than 20 years worth of experience in the field of graduate recruitment. And, I think when it comes to CVs, both yourself and Tracy, I definitely do encourage students to take you up on the offer of free access to that CV masterclass, and really just, how the market has evolved. And I think, when I had joined the world of work back then, to have a CV that was like quite long and detailed and in depth was probably more of the in thing back then, and probably as a student you felt a little inadequate because you didn't have a lot of job experience. But the market has changed, and I definitely think it is around keeping up to date with what is best practice around being able to put a CV together, what goes into it, how you structure it, etc. So yeah, I do encourage students, and Tracy and Peter are just, there's such a wealth of information, and if you've got free access, do it now. Log in, make sure that you take up that resource, because I mean, I really, it's an invaluable resource.
Appreciate that, Natasha. And right on cue, I think Tracy's joined us today, so she's put a comment there on the screen. So appreciate that input there, Tracy. And also just to mention to everybody that in the course, you'll be able to submit your CV as part of the assignment. And then Tracy will give you feedback on your CV as part of that course. And you'll be able to go through the lessons and then apply those in either creating a CV using a template that Tracy and I have put together and made available in the course, and then submit that into us in the assignment and get feedback from Tracy in that. So that I think is something very important there that you can take advantage of. So we've got sort of about 5 or 6 minutes left, Natasha, and I just wanted to maybe pick up on a couple of more questions here. David, I think, makes a point. Whether you imagine or experience the best or worst emotional situation, reality is you need pain to keep from harm and you need pleasure to keep life. Be aware of you and your actions responsibly. Okay, I mean, Natasha, probably a good observation there from David. Nothing wrong with that. Let's have a look at this question here. If you were a recent graduate and are looking for employment, how would you, in the scope of EQ, gauge whether the culture of the company would be good for you or not? And I think this is really good, going back to what we've covered already in this session, in terms of triggers, self-awareness, awareness of others, interpersonal behaviors, etc. Just give us a sense of, looking at companies from the outside or from the inside. How does EQ play into that to determine the fit, that Jean is asking about here?
This is such a relevant and important question. And, I think it's something we haven't touched on in terms of assessing emotional intelligence within a selection process. And, one of the things I do want to highlight, and it's quite a lengthy report, but the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report that was released sort of last year, October, November, confirms the significance of emotional intelligence being a sought after skill by employers. So, to Jean's point, we are going to encounter this in a selection process, whether it's quite structured and formalized through the use of an emotional intelligence assessment. But in a selection process, emotional intelligence is tapped into and assessed in so many different ways. And coming back to this question of culture fit of a company, a lot of companies will have their values on their website. So that is definitely one way, at least as a starting point, to get a sense of these are the company's values, and there's descriptors that go with it. So it helps to really understand what they mean when they talk about integrity or courage or whatever the case might be. So I think from a culture fit perspective, that is definitely a starting point. And then for yourself, examining to what extent does this align with my values. But how emotional intelligence often comes up in a selection process. And there's so many different ways, from the job description, which may highlight things like, and these are sometimes cliche phrases like they're looking for a team player or somebody who works well under pressure. These are tapping into those emotionally intelligent skill sets. Online application questions, for example, like tell us about your strengths and weaknesses. Again, assessing or tapping into an emotionally intelligent skill set. So in terms of the one-on-one interview, Jean, these are typically those behavioral questions that candidates will often get asked, and it often starts with, tell me about a time or a situation. And when you hear those questions, we're really trying to assess some of those emotionally intelligent behaviors. So, for example, tell us of a time you might have been faced with an ethical dilemma at work or university. Tell us about a time that someone criticized your work. Tell us about a time you had a disagreement with someone. And maybe another framework or another acronym around being able to answer those questions is kind of what we call the CAR framework, where when you're faced with those questions, how do you actually answer them in a way that can demonstrate a level of emotional intelligence? We talk about the context, share the context. So, one of the red flags when you're listening to a candidate maybe respond to these questions, for example, like tell us about a time you had to work under pressure. And when you get general or vague answers like, well, I stay calm under pressure, that doesn't really tell us much about your emotionally intelligent skill set. Or like, I work well with others. Again, very, very vague. So when I talk about the CAR framework, I always say, give an example, provide some context. I work well under pressure. Can I give you an example of why I say that? And then you can talk about, well, I had this team project. This was my role in the project. So providing some context around the example, then the actions associated, that's the A in the CAR framework, are what are the actions that you actually took or that you can show that demonstrates how you worked. What do you mean when you say you work well under pressure? And then what was the result of those actions? So it's just a better way to be able to answer some of those tell me about a time situations, because you're finding a way to articulate those emotionally intelligent behaviors. And then, a lot of those open-ended questions that we talk about that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers. For example, what are your strengths or weaknesses? Here we're trying to understand your sense of how aware are you of your strengths, of your weaknesses? Do you have some of that self-insight? Have you put things in place when it comes to talking about your weaknesses? So there's so many different strands of this emotionally intelligent skill set, but it is often those open-ended questions where they make you think. How do you de-stress after a hard day? How do you recover from failure? How might someone who's close to you describe you? So I hope that answers your question, Jean.
Definitely, Natasha. And just time for a couple of last questions. And on the topic of open-ended questions, you were mentioning earlier, when we sort of ask somebody, how are you? And it's just kind of a formality and it doesn't really get into it. Jack made a comment there these days. People ask, how are you? It's not a genuine question. It's just a way of greetings and nobody really cares, in my opinion. So my question to you, Natasha, is there a different question we can ask people? And you that are much more involved in and understand these issues, do you ask people a question other than how are you if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of their emotional intelligence? Is there something else that we can ask people instead of how are you?
So, I don't think we'll ever get away from how are you, right, Peter? But I also think our body language plays a lot into that. So, if it's somebody in passing, right, you go like, hi, Peter, how are you? And you're already like completely walked past the person. Everything about my body language says to you, I don't really have the time to stop and entertain your answer. But I definitely think, if we're intentional and deliberate about really wanting to connect with a person and you stop and you're engaged and you're making eye contact and your body language is open, if we say, how are you? Or, how are you doing? How are you holding up? I know that you had exams quite recently. How are you holding up? That definitely creates a space for I'm actually genuinely interested. And I think, before we can be interesting people, we have to be interested people. And I'm going to be quoting my friend there, Karen Huessen, who says that quite a lot, but it's really true. I think it is about congruence between what we're saying and all the other nonverbal cues.
Interested before interesting. I love that. Thank you, Natasha. I will ponder on that deeply as I reflect and put into practice a lot of what I've learned about emotional intelligence and the increased level of self-awareness that I have as a result of the value that you've given us all today in this discussion. And just to echo what I put up previously, Deirdre, who's joined us today, and I know well, says thank you, everyone, for so honestly sharing. And I think that is a key ingredient for having a meaningful conversation about emotional intelligence. So last thoughts from your side, Natasha, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. I'll put the details onto the Facebook group, and I'm sure that you'll all see it in the normal channels from the different universities, etc. But until we have you back on there, any closing thoughts then on emotional intelligence, Natasha?
So I think, just to reiterate, it's definitely not something that's static. It's a skill that we're working at all the time. And I think it's just around being intentional. So whatever it is in life, if we're intentional about pursuing it, growing it, developing it, we most definitely can. And I think that is the good news. And if I didn't get to answering a question that someone may have had, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to engage and connect.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. And on that point, guys, if you have subscribed to the YouTube channel, then we do aim to create answers to any questions that we don't answer in the actual webinars. And if you have more deeper questions related to what we've discussed today, then book either a Make a Difference free consultation with Natasha on a Monday, or pay for a consultation with her, and you will never regret it, because it'll be an investment in your career and yourself as an individual. But if you've taken the hour to listen today, then I'm certain you've really got some value from today's session that you can take forward into your success as a student and then on into your career in the workplace. Natasha, goodbye and thank you. Have a good weekend to everybody, and we'll chat same time next week, 12 o'clock.
Thanks, Peter.